Hello, Adriane Strampp.
Hello, Richard.
How are you doing there?
I am very well, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, look, delighted. And your exhibition is quite simply entitled New Work. It's at King Street Gallery on William in Sydney. And just before we have a chat, a reminder to the viewer, as I usually do, that the idea with these interviews is to be able to go to the gallery website to find the exhibition catalogue or the images for the exhibition and to have a look at those images at the same time as listening to our conversation, because we will be referring to specific images, and that's what will give people the best value out of this chat. So Adriane, lovely to have the chat, and let me start just with the very general kind of observation that as someone looks at a wide range of your images, there is this element of some uncertainty. One's not quite sure what it is that one's looking at. There is a certain mystery about them. Is that your absolute intent?
It is my intent, yes. I think that I am not, I'd like to start with saying I don't see myself as a landscape painter. And I use the landscape, but I will use other elements as well. A large part of that sort of diffusing process is more about kind of like I'm trying to make something that looks familiar to everyone, but you can't quite put your finger on it or what it is or where it is. And I think that's kind of a long story, but it goes back to my own sort of background when I was growing up.
Well, and that background, I think, is that you moved a lot. Your father's professional obligations meant that you moved a great deal as a child, and so there was this sense of constantly shifting. And in a way,
Yeah.
Is that partly what your works reflect?
That is very largely what my works reflect. Yes, it's so because we moved so much, it's kind of like I have I'm very comfortable with moving around, but I don't have that permanent sort of history or place that I am attached to. I can kind of go to any new place and make myself feel at home fairly quickly, but I don't have that long, like the kids you went to school with, or, people,
Yes.
high school days, and I can't remember anyone's names. There were too many schools, and so because of that moving, I don't have that sort of connection to one particular place that I would say is home. So sort of home can be anywhere for me, wherever I am, but I have attachments to places too. So often my work will go back to sort of things I remember, elements of things that I remember about a place that where we lived, or that I have happy memories of, and then I'll kind of collate them. So I might take, an element from, an incident when I was a child that I remember quite strongly, and then I might use a little bit of an Australian landscape in the background, or I kind of fuse different times and places. And so often I find people look at the paintings, particularly the landscape ones, and they might say, oh, I know where that is. But it never is any one specific place. It's kind of a combination.
Yes. And there is actually, we'll talk about them a little later in the chat, but there are a series of works in this exhibition which very much look as though you're moving along. I think they were, in fact, derived from a train journey that you took in the United Kingdom. But they have that sense of places fleeting past, perhaps like those many different residencies as a child that travelled past you. But I want to go to, let's go to some specific works. And just going back to that sense of uncertainty, of it not being quite clear what's going on. Perhaps a particularly strong example of that would be Light Falls.
Oh, yes.
It's very misty and uncertain, but what is going on? What are you trying to evoke in a work like that? What's the feeling that you want people to respond with?
Well, actually, that work is actually based on my current home here in Melbourne. And it is, I live in an old warehouse that I kind of renovated myself. And I put in these beautiful old windows that come from they were from a local primary school. So I've tried to keep all my building materials secondhand and recycled. And they're very beautiful windows. And every afternoon, the light falls through these windows. And because they're sort of multi-paned, old-fashioned windows, and it's quite a high ceiling, there's this beautiful sort of light that just goes across the room and in the afternoon. And I often photograph it, and because it's just a really funny sort of thing. It's like a really particular light, and it's, especially in the winter, in the afternoons, it's really beautiful. And it goes across one of my very dark paintings, one of my very dark grey paintings. So in the afternoon, you can't actually see the image of the painting anymore, but this light goes across it. And you can actually see it on my Instagram feed. I often take photos of it and put it on Instagram. But that painting is if you see that room, you will very clearly recognize that's what's happening.
It's fascinating, because that is a beautiful and very concrete description of what's happening in the painting, and yet the painting itself slightly seems to hide that from you. But now that you've explained it, it will be lovely for people to be able to see that. And similarly with another work, Flux, which seems to be, in many ways, a very recognisable landscape. I mean, I don't mean recognisable in the sense of knowing where it is, but recognisable that it is a landscape. But there is a mysterious column of light, or an impediment of light, if you like, across part of the landscape. Again, what's the choice for you in placing a little bit of mystery or a little bit of visual impediment for the viewer?
Oh, yeah, that's a very common technique that I use a lot in my work. And the Flux is actually based on quite a specific place. It's up in the very northern part of Wisconsin, where I spent some time growing up. I was born in the States, and I used to go up to the northern part of the state with my cousin quite a lot as a child, and up to this particular lake, and where she's just been at them recently, and sending me some photos. It was lovely. But it's kind of my memory of that place. But again, I don't want to just paint the landscape and say, oh, that's a lovely landscape and I'm going to paint that. It's more my emotional connection to it. And so my memory of going there as a child. And as you get older, you know how your memories sometimes start to, well, they change. They're not, as you mature, your memories change a little bit. You remember different things, some things fade away. So, and it's less and less sort of clear. So those sort of barrier marks that I use, or interference marks that I often put on my paintings, are a way of me, saying, I'm not here, I'm looking at it, but I'm from the outside as an observer. So I'm not in the landscape as a part of it, but I'm the outsider, which is kind of, relating to my background. And in Flux,
I'm sorry.
In Flux, where it's got that sort of vertical pink stripe that runs through the work, it's one of those barriers that it's kind of like a bit of dissolving going on. So a bit of the image is dissolving, which is a bit like my memory of that place.
I was just going to say, from how you describe it, memory, that sense of inviting the viewer to look at, perhaps even share your memory, even with its slight sense of distancing from the actual place or the object, is part of what's happening. How important is memory in the work?
I think it's hugely important, because for me, it's that I suppose my memory is my home. It's my collation of memories that makes up who I am and what I am, because I don't have that one thing I can just say that is me, that is where I'm from.
That's a great phrase, that memory is my home, and perhaps also, as you've said, memory is my identity. It's what makes all of us who we are. But going to a very specific, I mentioned earlier the images where the outside world seems to be travelling past you is, in fact, presumably what was happening on a train trip that you took in the United Kingdom, and a number of works, I think, in the exhibition from that. But the most obvious one is 1:29 p.m. to Paddington. Presumably that was the train time.
It was.
Yeah. So tell us about some of those images, and some of them are labelled as very specific places, perhaps along the way, presumably.
Yeah. So my parents live now for some time now, they have resettled in one place. And that was one of the places where I used to spend a lot of time as a child, in Somerset on the southwest coast of England. And so I go back to see them, and it's usually a 2 to 3, depending on which train you get. It can take an hour and a half to 3 hours to get there.
Yes.
And so I'm very familiar with that train journey down. And about halfway through, as you're heading towards Reading, there's a lot of canals, and I always love seeing the canals because they're they're so quintessentially English, and we don't see them here. You don't see canals here, and barges, and people live on barges. And so when you're going on the train there, that landscape is flicking past quite fast, and the canal kind of weaves. I love the way it sort of weaves its way in and out, and suddenly it's there parallel to the train tracks for a while, and then it disappears, and then it re-emerges. And so there was something about that rhythm and those flashes of the sky reflected in the water, the stillness of the water in that, compared to the speed that we were traveling, and yet the sort of stability of the water. And this, I think those sort of images, I felt very connected to them, because I suppose the journey is another part of my background, that constant on the move and traveling. So I'm quite attracted to that sort of ambiguity of trying to get those very fleeting moments.
Well, in the specific work called Reading Canal, you capture that, but also I have to say the feeling of the canal, and I think we can even see somebody on a small boat or some sort of craft on the canal. There is a sense of it being, as you say, that the canal itself being quite a solid, stable subject within the painting. But there's another work, Molesford. I hope I'm pronouncing the place correct. Molesford,
yeah.
Molesford. And in Molesford, there is a quite strong sense of movement. Literally, almost the image seems to slightly slide in the painting itself. So that does seem to be a bit more on the move.
Yeah, well, they all are. They're all about, all those paintings in the show, they're mostly smaller works. They are about just that train journey and that movement. So, that landscape was changing all the time. So I was just trying to capture what I saw, really.
And you've evoked that beautifully. Just going to some of the practicalities of it, as we look at the works, the palettes that you use seem to be very disciplined, very restricted, and deliberately muted. How has that evolved?
Yeah, I am a bit of a paint nerd.
That's a great label to wear with pride.
Yes, I am a paint nerd, I confess. Yeah, I'm like very specific about it. I will check the back of a tube of paint before I buy it to see the pigment numbers, and make sure that there's hopefully only one pigment in it. Not, I'm a bit of a purist about color mixing. So I like to use a limited palette, and I like to push it as far as I can. So I'll usually choose just one sort of reddish color, one vaguely bluish color, or maybe occasionally I use something called the Zorn palette, which is a
yes
hardcore minimalist palette.
But that's used a lot in portraits, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. But it's quite interesting. I find it interesting. I mean, it's probably deadly boring for everybody else, but I really find it interesting to see how far you can stretch the colors. So, if you have one red, one blue, and one yellow, you can mix your own black, and then you can gray them. You can make endless shades of in between, and then you can gray them off with a little bit of the black you've mixed, or you can lighten them up with a little bit of white. And so you can end up with this incredibly beautiful palette, but the colors are still connected because they originate from the same sort of, gene pool.
You mentioned mixing your own black, and I understand that you don't use black. You do tend to mix your own. That is actually quite a challenging thing to get right and to make work well, isn't it?
It is. Although I pretty much do it with my eyes closed now. But, it's, look, if you buy a tube of black, it's people, they'll sometimes just use it straight out of the tube, and sometimes it's leaves like a big hole in the painting because it might be a cold blue black or brown black. So when you mix your own, it just kind of sits much better. Just to as a side note, I went back to school and I did my master's, which I finished in 2010, and my thesis was on grey. So I wrote, I think
that is great. I think we are now completely convinced that you are a paint nerd, and with first class honours. But actually, just before that time, you mentioned 2010, but in 2009, you paid a trip to Venice, a quite important one, because you were looking, amongst other things, at the work of Tintoretto and the layering techniques. And that layering seems so important in your work. What did you learn from Tintoretto?
Oh, I have to tell you, I'm not a Tintoretto fan, but I did go to this to see his work. Yes. They're very dark images. They're very dark. But while I was there, I was fortunate enough to see one of his works that was being restored, and it had been taken off the stretcher, and so you could see the edges of the canvas, and I was able to see the layers of color that he had built up to achieve that sort of darkness. And what I had thought and what I was able to see was that he in fact used a lot of transparent colors so that he could layer up the colors in different sorts of reds and yellows and blues. So he would get almost a black painting, but it had this incredible light that traveled through the layers, so that it wasn't a dense, heavy painting. It still had the lightness, but it was very, very dark.
So you may not be a fan of the eventual works that he produced, but some of those techniques have really informed your approach.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. I work in layers myself, and I work in very fine, thin layers, and I build them up before I start dissolving them or wiping them back, and then I'll throw more on. With the when I was still working in a monochromatic way with the black or the grey paintings, I would build up so many layers that sometimes I think, it just needs one more, and you can be so light with just a little bit of paint and a lot of medium, and I'd just float one more layer on top, and then the whole image would just disappear, and it was too dark and it was gone, completely gone.
Tragic. Oh, well, let's move away from the tragedy, but it does actually, it really does give us a very good sense of just what a very fine balance that layering process is. Moving to something which we could actually see on the studio wall behind you. One of the works has a horse in it. And I wanted to refer to some of the horses. Works of yours in the past have had horses, stags, hares, various animals, often caught in what almost seems like a frozen moment. And there's one work in the exhibition that we're talking about, The Marshes, where there is a horse thoughtfully in the mists, or appears to be, just contemplating in the mists. Give us a little bit of a sense of why you include animals like horses and those others, and tell us a bit about the marshes.
Okay. Well, the animals appear in my work, particularly the horses. They tend to appear as a sort of a symbol of transition. So it's not, I don't think about it as, oh, I'm going to start painting horses. The horse has been in and out of my work ever since art school days. And it seems to always happen when I'm just kind of in a shift with the work. If, you know, I don't kind of conjure it up, it just happens. And then after a while, they just sort of you know, leave. And it's sort of out of my control. When it happens, and I let them go. And then once that I'm sort of settled in that new body of work, they disappear. But I think with the horse, I mean, I used to ride when I was a child, and I think what I like about the horses and kind of relate to them, I suppose they're part of the sort of semi-autobiographical element for me. I like the fact that you can never quite control them. They can be a bit flighty and a little bit vulnerable, but they're also incredibly strong. So I think with the other animals that have appeared in my work, I've only ever been attracted to the animals that have that same sense of independence and that sort of willfulness, I suppose. But not. No, they're just there's something about the ones that. Do you know what I'm trying to say? I find it hard to put it in words.
Like unpredictability. You just don't know quite which way they're going to jump. You know, whether they're a hare or a stag or a horse. And those animals like hares and stags, very much a European sensibility, I guess, as well.
Yeah, well, I suppose that, I mainly went to school in England, and so that's kind of feels the most like home to me, be hanging around in Europe. And so I have that sort of more European sensibility. I did do a residency with some of the other King Street artists at Taronga Zoo quite a while ago now. But I think it was 2011. But I fell in love with one of the tapirs and ended up doing a large series of drawings on him.
Wonderful animals.
I know. Baran.
I have to confess, I have a tapir T-shirt, which was sent to me by a dear friend who went to a World Tapir Conference. And so I share your tapir enthusiasm.
I am jealous. I want one.
Look, we should come towards a conclusion, but before we do, I do want to ask you about a series of small works, World Weather and Disasters. Intriguing, again, slightly ambiguous small works, but one does get a sense in these very small works of great natural forces in play. Tell us what's happening.
Yeah, occasionally I like to work on a very small scale, and those works are all very small works on paper. What happened was I was actually really sick. I was at home, and I couldn't come to the studio for a month, and I was so sick. But after a while, I was able to sit at the kitchen table, and I was desperate to start working again. So small works on paper are kind of something manageable. And I often sort of look for, when I'm painting, if I'm looking for particular sort of skies, say for, like one of these larger landscapes, I might use that sort of collage of elements from my past, but I might be looking for, a more dramatic pink sky. So I'll kind of trawl through news images and Google, or, everywhere until I find something that strikes the right chord with me. And so I kind of got a little bit obsessed with some of the natural disasters and how they're incredibly beautiful, and dramatic, but also terrifying and devastating so often. So those little works were something about having them so small contains them. They're not very dangerous. They're just small little works on paper, and they're sort of very beautiful, but they're something often very tragic at the same time.
Yeah, and again, as you mentioned much earlier near the beginning of our conversation, it's something that you're viewing from a distance. You're not actually in it. you're looking at it, and these small works give you the chance to do that. Look, thank you for working through these works in your exhibition. And we should mention that this present exhibition is a smaller version of the exhibition you were anticipating having at this time. Tell us actually what's happening with the future of the exhibited works.
Well, so what we've done is we've curated a smaller selection of the work that's going to be in the exhibition, just in order to give people a preview, I suppose, of the show that it will now be rescheduled down the track. And actually on Monday, the art trucks just started running interstate again. So I couldn't get the work up to Sydney from here until then. So I think it's actually due to arrive today. The exhibition will be rescheduled, and it will be a much larger show. And I think you'll have to wait and see. I'm still painting, so I'll be adding new works to the show as I go, and I might pull some out.
I look forward to the opportunity to have a conversation with you then as well. But for now, Adriane Strampp, thank you very much for sharing your exhibition.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.